right. Welcome back to the Diabolical podcast. I am your host, Eric Kane, and I apologize. I have not been keeping up with this podcast because that's just how life's been. I could make excuses, but I'm not going to do it. But thank you for listening. This is one of my favorite podcasts that I've put out. Mainly thanks to my guest. This week's guest is Austin Wintory, whose name you probably recognize if you've been paying attention at all to the video game industry, or especially the music of the video game industry. Wintory was the composer of Journey, the game that sort of took the world by storm back in 2012, became a huge success story for that game company, and for Austin himself, whose star certainly rose after that game sort of blew our collective minds. It's one of those games that I recommend everyone plays. It's something you can play in one sitting, and you can do even if you're not a gamer. It tells such an interesting story without any dialogue whatsoever. Its storytelling is visual and audio, told through the sights you see, the game mechanics themselves, the puzzles, the action, and of course the music, which is what we're here for today. 10 years ago, Journey came out, and now Austin Wintory has sat down with the London Symphony Orchestra and put together a completely reimagined soundtrack. So the score, as beautiful as it was back in the day, it really comes to life with the power of a full and incredible orchestra behind it. I've listened to this now, and it's absolutely stunning. It's breathtaking, and so yes. Listen to the podcast. Austin has lots of good stories to tell. He's very forthcoming and easy to talk with. He's a very interesting guy. So he has lots of interesting stories about his time, working on the game and getting into the industry and all of that. So give it a listen and let me know what you think. And thank you for your patience with this off again, on again, off again podcast of mine. Maybe I should just call it that from now on, the on again, off again podcast. But yeah. So, anyways, thank you very much and enjoy. Yeah. So yes, thank you for doing this on this kind of a big occasion, 10-year anniversary. It's crazy.
It really is. It doesn't stop getting surreal that it's been that much time.
It flies.
It's that classic paradox where it really does simultaneously feel like it was much longer ago than that. Because the overwhelming majority of my most meaningful life memories have taken place in the last 10 years. I've just had so many career opportunities and met new people and all kinds of things that it seems like, what was I even doing with my life before 2012, which is ridiculous. But there's just so much changed so fast when the game came out that it just doesn't seem like it could only have been 10 years. And yet at the same time, it does also feel like it just came out yesterday. Yeah. And it's amazing to me to think that 10 years in, people still talk about it. Even just by virtue of your interest in having this conversation, the fact that it's still, in some sense, newsworthy, is just baffling. Things tend to expire. It's like we all move on and onto the new thing we're excited about, usually within a week. And that's okay. I don't begrudge that. Like, I'm just as guilty of it.
It's sort of it's like I also from my perspective, it feels like Journey is an older game than 10 years. Also, not because of anything about the game other than it feels like a classic. Right. It's a classic, but it's only 10 years old. It's it's one of those games that I always tell everyone to play. Like, people who don't play games, I say play Journey.
It was the sort of unofficial motto of that game company while we were working. They said, we want to make games for people that don't know yet that they love games.
Yeah.
So I love that you're kind of evangelizing to the so-called non-gamers. That's awesome.
Well, everyone's got a gamer inside them somewhere.
I definitely feel that way because I look at it, nobody would say, I categorically won't read books or I won't watch movies or TV shows. It's like some people are junkies and are super diehard, or some people are like, the only book I ever read was Lord of the Rings, or Harry Potter or something, or somebody, is like, the only TV shows I watch are Ken Burns documentaries or whatever. But like, the market is wide enough that there are options for essentially everybody. And I know that it was overtly part of the whole founding of that game company, was the goal that be fixed, that they try to add more to the pot, so that if you're not jonesing for the next Call of Duty or Dark Souls or whatever, like, there's more options for you. I say this as a frustrated Elden Ring player.
Oh man, I'm really enjoying that game.
Oh, I gotta say, I don't think I'm at a point in my life anymore where difficulty curves that steep are my thing anymore.
Yeah, oh
Or I
yeah.
just have to face that I'm not as good as I wish I were.
I find that summoning is really key for the frustrating bits. Because I definitely look back when I was younger and I think I had more patience for
Yeah,
failure, and now I'm like, I don't know how many times I can do this, but I still love it.
no
Yeah,
kidding.
Journey came out. Well, I guess Journey came out similar to the time frame around when the first Dark Souls came out. I feel like that was a really unique time, really unique moment for games, especially indie games and smaller games like Journey. There was just sort of this. It was kind of a really perfectly timed release. I feel like because it was before the indie game market and the market for games like that became so flooded with content. Like if you look at like the Steam releases in the last 10 years, every year there's more and more and more games. As a journalist, it's hard to keep up with so many titles. I feel like I was more aware of everything coming out each month in
No kidding.
2012, 2013. And now it's like I don't even know. I don't even know half the time.
Well,
It's so much.
I remember, I did these games called the Banner Saga, and the first one came out in
Yeah.
2014. I signed on to the first game like, a month after Journey came out in 2012, and we spent about 2 years working on it. And I remember an interesting statistic where, when Banner Saga 1 came out in 2014 in the spring, if I remember, um, on Steam, something in the neighborhood of 70 games came out that same month. Um, and so the game, also it had had a successful Kickstarter, but like, it had it didn't have a huge challenge standing out amongst
Hmm.
70. By the time the third, and it was always planned as a trilogy. By the time Banner Saga 3 came out in, I want to say 2019, 2018, 2019, that same month it was like 500 games came out. So there was a just more than fivefold increase
Yeah.
in the number of games per month on Steam in that span. And Journey was even 2 years before the 70 per month. That was 2012 versus 2014. So it's like there has been just this truly exponential curve. Also, I often say to folks, the number one word that I'll just repeat ad nauseum with regard to Journey for a million reasons is
Mhm.
gratitude. So much is so out of our control, and as you said, there's so much that was just the luck of timing, because Journey in its simplicity really stood out, in 2012. But there's so many games that I would say are of a similar vein. Now you could argue that maybe Journey helped inspire them in the 10
Yeah.
years since, but if we kind of set aside that concept, and I don't presume as much, then I think that the game, just on the face of it, would have so much harder of a time, and I don't know that it would do particularly well today. And even being exactly the same, it's just, yeah, it was one of those truly lucky. Never mind the fact, also on top of that, that TGC had this like three in a row winning streak of Flow. It's like niche hit, but definitely got that underground cult following kind of vibe. And then Flower kind of like just cracked the edges of the
Mhm.
mainstream. Like I remember it was nominated in like the Spike VGAs and stuff. And so it was getting, alongside whatever Halo and Call of Duty were contemporaneous to it, that sort of thing. So Journey was kind of like able to hit that escape velocity and just sort of become more broadly known. And all those things seem to just be so circumstantial. It's why like
Yeah.
you always want to feel like, yes, I did a good job, or yes, I'm so clever. And it's like, yeah, dude, if the game had come out, like a week earlier, what if things had been different? That sort of thing.
What if a global pandemic had hit, you know, in the middle of developing that game? I mean, right? Like
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
there's totally true. There's so much luck involved in everything, obviously. But I mean, the game itself was pretty brilliant. Like the soundtrack, obviously, is one of my favorite video game soundtracks of all time. And it just fits the game so well. There's very few games that have a soundtrack that feels like it is just interwoven with the game experience itself. Um, and I wonder if
Well, that's very kind of you.
how did that come about? Like how did the actual how is it that that game and its music are so tightly woven together and feel so natural together?
Well, it's very kind of you to say that they are. Just in the spirit of what we were just saying, I couldn't even guarantee that that would be the outcome, even though it was undoubtedly the goal. And the long and short of it is, it's pure elbow grease. It's not that I had some divine insight. I spent 3 years working tightly with that game company. The Flower came out. I went to the Flower launch party. I didn't work on Flower, but just as a supportive friend of the company, went. And I remember Genova and I talking kind of in a back area. And he said, let's get dinner, tomorrow or whatever. And I'd love to show you kind of what we're thinking of next. And we went to dinner, had a little catch up, and he started telling me about the third game. And pretty much everything he told me that day is what the game came to be. I mean, it was very skeletal, and there were a lot of details that were not quite there. Most notably, there wasn't a mountain in the distance. It was more like just traversal, and then very quickly, Matt Nava, the art director, um, um, became like he had they had this idea of a kind of like canyon wall with a crack in it, um and so it's clear that you're heading to that kind of destination, and then that evolved into the idea of a mountain. It's just so kind of universal of a symbol of like this thing to summit, to beat, to sort of to defeat, as it were, in the non-combative sense, like I beat the mountain kind of thing. Such a classic and archetypal sort of symbol. um but uh but the notion of a desert and all that was all very clear. And so I remember he called me down the next day, and we got into a little bit more detail after that initial dinner. And he said, you know I really want the emotions to be at the forefront, which was always the case. Flow and Flower were the same. So, he likes to start with music. He likes to let music be the thing that helps guide the team as much as the concept art, where it's like, okay, because Genova works a bit backwards from other game developers. It's worth explaining. Most developers will say, like, I've just developed a really cool, time looping mechanic. And so, like, it's really fun, like a game like Braid or something, like I've got this really cool thing, and it can really be an interesting X factor in a 2D platformer, for example. I don't know how John Blow made that game. I'm just using it as a random example. But the idea of, here's my cool mechanic, and now I want to craft a story and an art direction and all that, which seems to kind of fall out of this mechanic. And then at the end, you play it and you go, oh, this game feels like X. And the emotional experience is descriptive. But Genova, it's completely backwards from that. For him, it's prescriptive. He goes, I want to feel lonely. What game mechanics would make me feel lonely? What art style would make me feel lonely? What narrative would make me feel lonely? Like, to him, it's always reverse engineering from the emotional starting point. And he likes to use music as the way to kind of define the emotion in a way that everybody can agree on. Because if you just say, oh, lonely for one person might be, wistful and nostalgic. Another person might be like cripplingly painful, like lonely. All emotions are going to have a wide spectrum of interpretations. And so he likes to put a piece of music, as it were, up on the chalkboard and say that the way this piece makes you feel, the level design, the art direction, the character design, a lot of everything should chase that. And obviously it's not quite so pure. It's not like I scored the game before they made it, but we would always start, every time we kind of, the development would move into a new area of the game, a new level, as it were. We would always start with music, and I would create just we'd talk about the goal of that part, in the case of Journey, Genova had very much this beyond the Joseph Campbell hero's journey aspect of it. There was this is sort of the metaphor for a human life. So, you start off at birth, then there's the kind of sort of toddler, like getting your sea legs kind of idea, and, learning to walk. And then I remember very particularly, for example, the open desert, the third stage of the game. On the album, I refer to it as Threshold, and it's kind of the part that creates the illusion of almost being an open world game, and sort of the poster image section of the game. He always said, this should feel like you're a teenager. And this is just before that, kind of end of adolescence, where it's a big playground. Nothing really can go wrong. You have no perception of dangers in the world. And then you migrate from there into kind of teenage and young adulthood with the surfing area of the game, where it's now, I'm powerful. I can do anything. I am, way overinflated sense of yourself in terms of your ability to accomplish things. And there's a real fun in that. There's an intoxication and a real boost in energy. And so to him, everything was sort of metaphorical up through, the end of life and some kind of transcendence. And that was all very clear. So we would talk about that, and then I would go and write a piece of music that seems to kind of somehow explore that idea. And then, we might iterate on it, but he'd get to a place where it's feeling good. And then the team would all have the ability to kind of listen to it and, loop it while they work on the game, or they code or whatever. And then, of course, as the build started to take any kind of tangible shape, I would immediately then start to play test it and carve up the music to say, okay, I don't write tracks. I don't write just loops. Like, this has to be a thing that's living and breathing and dancing with the player. I feel this way in general about scoring games, but Journey in particular, it was essential that, if the player goes and does this, the music needs to somehow react. And if the player goes around that thing and does something different, the music should do that. And if the player stops and goes and just sits down and meditates and sets the controller down, the music should acknowledge that. I don't like when things are just sort of static and forever trapped in a given state. And so I would just play the game and start looking for those opportunities, how to make this work. And then invariably what would happen is, I'd write initially just a 2-minute piece and set it to loop just to kind of see how it works atmospherically before working out the more particular details of how it's going to elegantly come and go and build itself up, take itself apart, all those kinds of details. And some kind of happy accident would occur where, strings would come in right as I come around this corner and behold a vista and think, oh, wow, how do I make sure that will always happen? How do I ensure that it's not a happy accident, but it's a happy, mandate? And so there was just a ton of this kind of trial and error, and I'd never done anything of remotely this level of complexity. So, thank God they needed so much time to work on the game, and it was so behind schedule and everything, because I used every minute of the 3 years. I worked on it absolutely till the very last day where it was off to gold mastering at the beginning of 2012. And just constantly iterating, constantly fine tuning, constantly looking for opportunities, play testing and realizing, players they're not even going over to that area very often. I had this whole idea that we needed to do some big musical statement, and I'm realizing it's just so off the beaten path that, nobody would notice. But meanwhile, players are going over here a lot, and I kind of underestimated that, and the music is not really equipped to deal with that. So it's just a lot of all this kind of thing.
It sounds like an enormous growing period, like growing your craft, learning, and I mean, certainly it must have influenced everything you've done since.
Without question, and especially philosophically. I mean, no doubt my craft as a composer, and particularly music designer, a term that I like to use that just kind of refers to the difference between the writing music versus designing the interactive systems that really make it come to life in the context of a game. I credit my friend and colleague Guy Whitmore with that phrase, music designer, but I really like that notion that we're not just writing music in the same way that a film composer is not merely writing music and then just slapping it against picture. At least my favorite examples are they're really scoring to the scene, and they're really trying to be a co-storyteller with the director and the actors and the cinematographer and all that. And I see my role is very analogous. The goal is to get into the guts of the interactive systems, no differently than the animators and the narrative designers and anybody else on the team. So yes, I definitely learned huge amounts about what's possible. And my sense of ambition was expanded, 100-fold by the end. But even more importantly, just philosophically, those questions of kind of what is the music's purpose? What is the best way to support an experience, and also just kind of games interest me. What kind of as both player and as composer, and how do I best serve it? I mean, it really changed me. It was sort of the artistic equivalent of the old sort of 50s notion of sitting on the microwave and letting it kind of reprogram your DNA. It really I had so much exposure to such a kind of radical way of approaching game design and storytelling that it fundamentally altered my sort of true north of the best practices. And I love working with really disparate teams. I've been very lucky that since then I've worked with all manner of different teams, from big ones to small ones to people who are making their first game to people that have been in the industry longer than I have. And I really enjoy the kind of diversity of perspectives that brings. So it's in no way that I now only want to work with people like that game company. It's really no one like them anyway. That would give me a client base of one, as it were. So it's not a very good business decision. Um, but I do really cherish that. And I always thought to myself, if I ever were to make my own game, I would probably end up modeling my process very much on theirs. That the idea of the underlying point and philosophy of it being the most important, and not just simply the forward-facing mechanics or whatever. As obvious as that sounds, it really wasn't obvious at the time. So many games, the first thing in the press release would be, the fidelity of the graphics, or the length of the campaign, or blah 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 blah. Like, it was never about the thoughts that it kicks over, or the way that it might affect you in contemplating your life, or all those kinds of things. And so yeah, it's just not to be underestimated, I guess, how much it seemed to really kind of alter my perspective. It was exactly the right age too. I was just young enough that I sort of still was mostly blank page as a person in many regards, but I was not so young that it would have been lost on me, that I would have, it would have kind of, because we all are stupid, in our earlier days. And every 10 years we look back and think, oh, I didn't know anything. And I definitely look back now and think, because I was 13 years ago that, came out 10 years ago, started on it 13. I was 24. Wow. It's like I say, it's sort of just old enough to not be a complete moron. But the other thing that's crazy when you think about it, I remember this dawning on me shortly after it came out. It came out when I was 27. And from age 24 to 27, that's well over 10% of your whole life that you've just spent doing one thing. And I'd never focused, unless you consider like high school or something as this single unit, which it's very much not in my mind. I mean, it's this like massive quilt of 1,000 different things. I'd never spent that amount of time with essentially one goal. Now, I worked on other things in tandem. I was scoring movies and other games and things, but it was sort of this omnipresent, it'd be almost I don't know how well this analogy works, but it's kind of like if you imagine driving around throughout the city, making a lot of stops and whatnot, but you have the radio on, like on a specific, talk radio host or something. And so that you have this omnipresent voice, no matter all these different places you're going and things you're doing, there's this thing that's traveling with you. That's very much how it felt with Journey. The game, it never, in a way, it felt like it was never even going to come out. It just was this, and which I'm sure, Sony was starting to worry about being the actual reality at some point, but it did just kind of feel like this is a thing I'm just going to work on. This is like my Gothic cathedral that I will eventually hand it off to my son, and they will continue it and hand it off to theirs, and none of us will ever have known what the final product was like. Kind of felt like, and the truth is that wouldn't be so bad in my mind. I loved working on it. I know um, it was extremely daunting for that game company. It was very difficult for them. I was largely oblivious to their internal challenges, and just the they were all giving all of themselves, and so was I. But somehow that was more painful for them. For me, it was very joyous. I loved the act of giving it my all. Was like an ecstatic act for me.
That's pretty cool. I mean, that's a pretty cool. I mean, at 24, you're just really getting into the whole business. I imagine. Like before before Journey, how long had you been composing for video games?
Well, my first commercial release of any kind, film or game, was Flow. Um, I met Genova in 2006, and we did Flow with Nick Clark, the three of us, in it as a student game, and it came out as a little Flash browser thing, and then went nuts online somehow. And to this day, I don't understand how it went viral. Like from a pragmatic standpoint, I don't understand, because social media, other than like MySpace, Facebook was still only for university students, and even then, it was a small network of university students. Like it was like 20 colleges or something, and maybe more by that point. But I remember joining it in 2003 or four, like I was at NYU, and I remember joining it when NYU. I remember we always laughed because we were the first. We were like, I guess Facebook is starting to slum it because it was the Ivy League schools only, and then they added NYU as the first non-Ivy League, and we were kind of like, yeah. And but then I moved out to LA, and shortly after that, and so there was no YouTube or Twitter or any of the kind of normal ways that people spread information. It was literally, I guess, just manually emailing people, or I guess messaging them a link in like AOL Messenger or ICQ or something. I just don't really know how it went as viral as it did, because I mean, it was like hundreds of thousands of players almost immediately. Now, of course, it was free, and it was a little Flash browser thing, so there was no real barrier to entry that could slow down that spread. But still, I'd never seen anything I'd never imagined, especially because I was literally still a student. And I remember maybe a month or two later, Kelly Santiago, who was a classmate of Genova's, called me and said, Sony has approached us. They're getting ready to launch the PS3, and they're looking for launch titles. They're going to be creating this new thing called the PlayStation Network, where not every game has to be a box title now. Like that, there's this concept that they're going to explore of a downloadable title, and they want Flow to be essentially the pilot of that, plus one or two other games. And Sony's perspective, as I've been able to diagnose it, was that they figured, well, look, we've got the big blockbusters. They were already well into God of War as a franchise, and they had Uncharted cooking as a PS3 game, and so like they, and plenty of others as well, where they thought, okay, we're clearly no slouch in the domain of the big AAA blockbuster type games, but we also have an opportunity to be an incubator to sort of innovative and interesting and weird, Wes Anderson types. Like we don't have to just be the Bruckheimers, or later the kind of MCU type games. It was we can be the blend, and that's going to be one of their kind of competitive differentiators from Microsoft. So they were looking for talent for this. Again, this was all just me assessing what appears to be their motivation, because it seemed like if you make a game like Flow, you spend, $1 million or $2. It doesn't really matter if it's profitable in the margins of a company like Sony. That can largely be seen as a rounding error. But if that kind of thing makes people go to the PS3 or think of the PS3 when they think about, like, where's the new interesting stuff coming? So we were just the stupid, dumb luck beneficiaries of, we made a weird thing that they apparently thought was interesting. So they approached us, and so we spent the better part of a year remaking and substantially expanding the scope of Flow. And it came out in early 2007. And I was very lucky that immediately on launch, I had the opportunity to start scoring two different films that I met. One was a director who was my neighbor. He was the first person I met when I moved to LA. He literally lived in the apartment above me in Los Feliz. And then the other was a guy I'd met. We were both students. He was at AFI getting his directing master's degree, and I was finishing my degree at USC. And he emailed the school looking for a composer. And so I scored his film, and it ended up playing at the Sundance Festival and winning the audience award, and got a lot of attention, including a pretty decent amount of notice for its score, because it's one of these movies, not unlike Journey, where it's very sparse on dialogue, and it lets the music really live at the forefront of the experience. And it's also similarly, in a way, kind of like lush strings. And in so many ways, that score was my prototype to kind of like figure out some of the initial technique that would serve me on Journey. Is a Jordanian film. It also got notice in that regard as well, for being the first feature film from the country of Jordan ever. And so it was submitted to the Oscars, foreign language, and in fact, when it didn't get Oscar nominated, because it won like 40 film festivals and stuff, when it didn't get Oscar nominated for foreign film, the LA Times did a big write-up saying this movie should have been a serious contender for Best Picture and the obvious winner for foreign film. And the fact that it didn't even get nominated shows the Academy is just not watching the movies. Remember, it was like an LA Times editorial that really, really came out in favor. And then right as that movie was coming out, I started working on that film for my neighbors, which was like a psychological horror film. And that film ended up playing at Sundance as well, and really kind of launched his career. We just had our fifth or sixth movie come out like 3 weeks ago, or 4 weeks ago. So that's been a real long running relationship. So it's like, just by extreme dumb luck, within that first year or so, it was like Flow and then those two movies all in quick succession. And it's not like I was suddenly, kind of like, it was a very Spartan living, independent film and all that. Flow was actually, I remember, was one of those where it felt like I had won the lottery, because it felt like such an incredibly paying job relative to the $100 for this 3-minute student film that I had been used to up to that point. And so the funny thing was, it put me in a position to be able to sort of survive on my savings for a couple of years. And it bought me just enough runway that the projects I was doing, I was able to invest in those projects, like that film Grace, the psychological horror film. I remember that was the film that finally killed my savings, because I really, I got really ambitious with the score. Our budget was like next to nothing. And so I just decided to just spend money until it was good. And I completely and totally drained my savings to zero as a result. So yeah, all those kinds of things were those early days, and then just hustling nonstop, and cobbling together a very Spartan living. And I was in a relationship. We were living together. We had a dual income with no kids. And that was also a truly essential part of the equation as well. Like I wasn't the sole earner, but it was literally, I mean, I would have to score dozens and dozens of little, short films and things where they were like, we can maybe swing you $500. It's just sort of like constantly, doing a ton of work for very little, but doing so much of it that I was able to just squeak by. But it was great. I mean, it was one of those where I don't look back at that and see it as a time of struggle. I look back at it and I think, I was it was building relationships. It was getting things rolling. It
Mm-hmm.
was, um, meeting interesting people. I meet people, I met a guy somewhere in the midst of all of that who ended up being the one, 13 years later, who recommended me on the new Aliens Fire Team Elite. So I mean, it was sowing the foundations of my career in a very legitimate way, even back then. And you never know when things will kind of blossom, as it were.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt that in a way I was biding, without realizing it, I was biding my time, and then signing on to do Journey. I was really excited about the game. I loved the concept behind it, and I remember just hoping people would. First off, I hoped that game company could pull it off, because I remember explicitly thinking, I've never heard of a game that has this type of ambition. Where Genova was very particularly talking about the multiplayer being this
Yeah.
non-antagonistic, very kind of loving and supportive multiplayer dynamic, and I just thought, players always find a way to like, there will always be some troll or whatever. I don't see how you can make it totally troll proof. And fuck me if they didn't figure that out. But I remember thinking, I hope that you can figure this out, because that sounds like the next stage of gaming. It made me realize I've been waiting my whole life to play a game that explores these kinds of more poetic ideas. And I can't believe I get to be part of it, but I never had any sense that it could possibly be as successful as it would turn out to be. That was the thing. Of course, one always hopes that, people will notice, but
Right.
I didn't expect anything approaching what happened as a result. And then the night and day shift that occurred with my career, in terms of just, the kinds of meetings I suddenly found myself able to get, and the kinds of opportunities that started showing up, and the kinds of games, just the sheer quality of things, and just that incredibly astonishing and bizarre fact that people would, suddenly now, like, I would walk into a meeting and they would be more familiar with my work than I was with theirs, which is a complete 180 from anything I had been accustomed to up to that point. It felt bizarre.
Yeah. Good feeling though, I'm sure.
I mean, of course, it's a good feeling to know that, there are opportunities, and that I'm not 30 days out from missing my rent payments or buying groceries. Like, there were definitely a few times where I thought, I'm going to have to ask for help if something doesn't work out in the next 2 weeks. And to suddenly realize, to really kind of almost overnight not be in that position. And it's not like I suddenly became some billionaire or something remotely at all like that. The shift from instability to stability was huge. Just knowing, okay, I have enough runway that, I could, if all my work stopped today, if suddenly there was just this complete and total halt, I could weather a storm for months, maybe even over a year. And I've never gone that long without finding some kind of job. So, like, it made me realize I probably don't have to worry anymore. And it was just an incredible. And again, I say all this as just a statement of gratitude. I didn't make Journey a hit. It was like the audience collectively decided that by just reacting passionately, and that the second order effect of that, of the industry going, oh, well, the people that worked on that might be able to bring something to our project. Like, I can't control any of that. None of us have any ability to mastermind those lucky things. And so, you just have to hope that you're in a position to kind of leverage it, like not miss out on the opportunity when it's there. And so it's just,
Well,
it's just luck.
it must be very competitive. I mean, I think about 24-year-olds now trying to get into composing music for video games. That must be a huge challenge for a lot of people. Just because I'm sure there are just so many talented people who would like to make music for video games and
There
movies
are
and,
so many.
TV. And I'm sure that since then we talked about how many games are coming out, but the industry keeps changing and growing and getting more competitive, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Like, art in general, music, art, all those things, there's so many talented people, and I just imagine it must be such a struggle for these young people to get into the business.
It is. that's a big part of why I like to remain. I started a YouTube channel that I really the last couple of years have been pretty aggressively cultivating. Um, and in terms of YouTube, it's still a modest sized channel, but it's also there's a good healthy dose of it that's catered towards younger composers, where there's a kind of a strong podcasting element to it, and I look for excuses to hit up friends and colleagues of mine with noteworthy uh, games and films and things to their name, and ask them questions and kind of put information out there that could be useful. And I put up a lot of behind the scenes about my own material, where I'll break things down, or I'll open up a mix session and step through and show all the layers of how a piece is built and how it was mixed and all that. Or I load the sheet music to tons of pieces of mine, where you can see exactly what's there. You don't just have to kind of listen, but here's literally, and I'll add text commentary to say, like in the context of the game, this would have been the loop point, but for the soundtrack, of course, it just keeps going, and a lot of I put a lot of that on there. The hope being, and I get good feedback in the comments and from emails and stuff, that younger composers are noticing it. And my absolute favorite is when teachers who teach in composition programs will email me and say, we use your channel a lot in our program because that's there's a lot of resource to it. So I because I recognize I'm so lucky that the least I could do is try to help arm people with anything that I know in case it could help them. And part of that is because I just enjoy that. That's just sort of me, sort of, doing my part for a community. These are the kind of qualities I would like to see in the community. And what can I do beyond just sort of uphold that in my own? I would, people can, other composers can treat the up and comers, as it were, however they want. And I wouldn't begrudge anyone who has no interest in that. It's completely up to them. I like to add that vibe to the community. But also I was a recipient of it. There were a few composers that were extremely generous to me when I first moved to LA, and it's not like they, that I got work from them necessarily, or that they, passed my name around in certain circles. That just made me feel welcome, and they made LA not feel like this scary place where I didn't know anybody, because I moved here knowing no one. I had lived in Manhattan for a couple of years when I was at NYU, and I grew up in Denver before that. So, I came out here literally knowing no one. I had no family. I had no friends. And so I'm lucky that, a very close friend of mine happened to be the guy I met the day I moved, because he lived in the apartment above me, and we really clicked. And, we've had a great career together so far. And he's just an all around wonderful guy. And, that was just luck of the draw. It's probably the only neighbor I've ever really developed a relationship like that with in 17 years of living here too. And then, but a professor at NYU had connected me to a composer that was out here a few years before me, who had been one of his students. And he was like, "Oh, you should hit up Jim." And this guy, Jim Dooley, had set up, he was one of Hans Zimmer's guys now. And he invited me down to Hans's place and was like, come check out, we'll have lunch. And so I got to go. It's called Media Ventures still, I believe, at the time. Now it's called Remote Control Productions. He had me down and just made me feel very welcome, and we've been friends ever since. And then there was another guy, Nate Barr, who I'm trying to even remember how we met. I think we met at it was like a fan event. Like, he was signing autographs because he had just done this kind of the Eli Roth movie Cabin Fever, or maybe it was Hostel, like these kind of slasher films that were modest hits. And there was kind of like a, there's events around town all the time. Like there's a kind of, horror themed merchandise kind of shop called Dark Delicacies that would do composer signing events. And they would have like, here's 5 composers who've done recent horror films, and it's people for the soundtrack nerds to go. And so I went to one. I think that's where I met Nate, and he was like, we just hit it off, and he was like, let's get dinner. And he, we became real close friends, and he's had an incredible career since then. I remember one of our sushi dinners a few years later. he was super stoked because he was like, I just got a job I'm really excited about. I feel like it's going to be something special. And he started telling me, he was like, the guy that wrote American Beauty, his name's Alan Ball. He started making a vampire show with Anna Paquin, and they asked me to do the score. And that was True Blood. And that really launched his career to the next level. He's doing the Borderlands movie now. He's just, and he was married at the time to a singer named Lisbeth Scott, who had just recorded a solo for John Williams on the movie Munich. And I found her voice to be absolutely incredible. And I asked him to put us in touch. And she ended up being my singer on the end credits of I Was Born for This in Journey. That's her singing as well. So like, to me, these people, these things don't happen in a vacuum. It's like these people were really instrumental in me just feeling like I have a place in this community and I'm not some outsider who has to convince everyone of my value to be here. It's like, you are welcome. Convince the directors that it's worth hiring you in the game studios and those kinds of things. But the composer community, pull up a chair. Not every composer, acts that way, but it made a big difference to me that those particular ones that I happened to meet did. And so I'd consider it a sort of a philosophical importance to offer up the same. So anyway, I don't remember how we got onto this, but there's
no, it's good. It's really interesting. I guess we should talk about the 10th anniversary release of these tracks. Tell me about what is this exactly? What's happening with this 10th anniversary Journey soundtrack?
So this is an entirely new thing. It is, so a few things converged. A couple years ago, 2018, is that right?
In the before times.
Must be 2019. Yeah, for sure the before times, but at some point, Darren Korb, who has done Supergiant's games, Transistor, Bastion, Pyre, and Hades, he and I are real good friends. And he called me up and said, next year, I'm thinking this was early 2019, and it was later that year, I think. It was like in the fall, corresponding to PAX in Seattle. Supergiant was going to be turning 10. And Darren, who is kind of a Radiohead style, singer-songwriter and record producer, rock band kind of guy, and unbelievably talented in that capacity. He reached out and said, we had this idea of it'd be fun to do a concert and to celebrate 10th anniversary of Supergiant. And he said, I can pick, what I think are, as it were, the greatest hits of music over the last 10 years and put on a show. And we thought it could be cool to do it as kind of like an orchestra show in some way. And he said, you want to help me with that? And I was, he and I are good friends, but I'm also just a fan of his work. And so I said, oh, dude, what a joy that would be. So we set about creating a show where he would sing, as well as Ashley Barrett, who sings on all those games as well with him. And I would conduct like a chamber orchestra, and we would transform all these songs into like, almost like little small symphonic. And it feels operatic to me now. I was like, Darren, you've been writing operas and musicals without any of us realizing it, because they're so lush in their storytelling and they're so good. So we set to work on that, and we performed it at PAX. It was a huge, like, sold out crowd, and it went over amazing. And it was this big, and Hades was not done. It was in early access, and he still was very much deeply immersed in writing the music still. After the success of that concert, Supergiant approached me and said, would you be interested in producing a studio recording of this? This went so well, and it all turned out so well that a proper record could be a great way to memorialize it. And I said, absolutely, I would be thrilled to produce that record and conduct it and whatever else you need from me. And so, first things first, let me prepare for you some budget range options so you can know the difference between the kind of, A, B, and C scale, where the A is, let's spare no expense. Let's do it at Abbey Road in Studio 2, where the Beatles recorded, let's make a record. And Hades early access, I guess, was going well. They chose the A option. So we started getting the wheels in motion to do this 10th anniversary Supergiant record at Abbey Road in secret. And then I was also finishing up the Pathless, and I needed to go to Abbey Road for some recordings for that score anyway. And I was able to, just by dumb luck, I was able to kind of align it so I could go out. It was one trip. And we basically just spent a week there where, we did Darren's record and then I did my Pathless stuff. And it was like, that was the very early days at that point then of 2020, because I remember we came back from Abbey Road and then PAX East was happening. And so we did the concert again. Nobody knew we had secretly recorded it at that point, and it was going to be coming out later that year. And on top of that, I remember saying to Darren, you haven't finished writing the music for Hades. There's got to be some use for this orchestra. We're going to be in there with the studio with them. There's got to be a place in Hades. So he said, well, actually, I haven't finished the very end of the game yet. And when you kind of beat the final boss, it could really justifiably be an interesting moment if an orchestral piece is what emerges instead of what I've been doing. And then he said, I'm also starting work on this end credit song called In the Blood, and it could be an interesting thing to mix orchestra that. So we ended up essentially co-writing those last two pieces of the game. And he really let me add in, all kinds of material that was fundamentally not part of the song. And we, kicked it back and forth together, and it was amazing. So we recorded all that in London, and in the midst of all this, the most famous orchestra in the world probably is the London Symphony. They're the orchestra that recorded Star Wars, Harry Potter. They've been around for ages. They're truly just superhuman talent level musicianship. Just absolutely one of the most famous orchestras in the world. And somewhere around this time, a little before this, they had just randomly reached out to me, complete cold call, and said, if you ever, are interested in working with us, we'd be interested in working with you, which was like a bucket list level. Like if I could do that once in my life, I'd be thrilled, kind of thing. And so they, when I was going to be at Abbey Road with Darren and doing Pathless, I invited their guy to come to the studio and hang out, and we could brainstorm, like, what could we do together? Because while I record in London fairly often, I don't typically record traditional orchestral music. I'm always doing weird stuff, like 18 clarinets, and like on Absu, we did 7 harp with women's choir. And, I'm never doing things that really kind of justify hiring the London Symphony, because they're a traditional orchestra, and I so rarely write traditionally orchestral music. But I loved the idea. And so we hung out, we got along great, and said, well, let's find something. Well, so flash forward to 6 months ago, and all these thoughts popped into my head at once. It was like, oh yeah, I still need to find something to do with the London Symphony. And oh yeah, that experience of celebrating the 10th anniversary of Supergiant Games with this kind of like orchestral reimagining was a really amazing experience. I wonder if there's any equivalent to that in my life. And oh yeah, Journey's about to turn 10. And so it was this collision of what would happen if I went back to Journey and I completely rewrote the score as this lush, grand symphonic statement. And to be clear, Darren's is a chamber orchestra. It was maybe 14 musicians. This is a 91-piece orchestra with 32 voice choir. And I Was Born for This, another, 10 or 11 additional singers. And 1 violin soloist, plus Tina Guo playing solo cello again. So it was like, all told, 134 musicians played on this new album. Wow. So I reached out to the London Symphony and I said, assuming we could make it work with COVID and that kind of thing, what do you think of celebrating Journey if I were to, without any warning and kind of Beyonce style, just drop an album with, no heads up on the day of the anniversary, of the 10th anniversary, that takes the entire score, all, it's about an hour of music, start to finish, and reimagines it. In some cases, dramatically altering it. In other cases, just giving a totally new instrumental palette to what was before very Spartan. Because, people have a tendency to think of Journey as an orchestral score because the most memorable part of the game uses this small group of strings the very ending of the game has strings in there, and we had about 22, I think, strings in the orchestra. But it's not. It's really overselling it to call it orchestral, because that album and the score both the album and the score is kind of like the ingredients you would find on a given new age album, where it's, a few string soloists, a lot of reverb, a lot of synth pads, and then a little bit of strings and some vocalists. And it's really quite spare by design and very ethereal and minimalist. And because it steps out from that into something a little bit more lush for the very end of the game, but because that's the most memorable part, people have this impression of a very orchestral thing. But I thought, what if we did it orchestrally in earnest? So my little kind of catchphrase has become, if we define Journey's original as a new age album, this new Traveler album, I'm calling it Traveler, a Journey Symphony, which I don't actually love that title, but I had to go with that title. But but I like calling it just Traveler. It sort of speaks to the 10 years that have come, as much as it is an homage to Journey, and I've come to actually like that as just a standalone name for the album, Traveler. It helps that that's one of my best friend's son's name, and he came to the session and hung out with us while we recorded. But if we define Journey as a new age album, this is like a Studio Ghibli album now. The idea is, what if we expanded the scope? It's still Journey, and working on these arrangements was extremely challenging, because it was so easy to let the sheer size of the orchestra get away from me, and then it stops feeling like Journey, because it just becomes like this grand, epic, thundering, romantic, like operatic, over the top kind of music, but that's just fundamentally not Journey. So the question was, okay, before the goal was, can I make a couple of instruments sound really big and full? Now it's, can I make a shit ton of instruments feel really intimate and warm and homey? And it was an interesting challenge. I hadn't done anything quite like this before. And I'd certainly never revisited old music of mine in this regard in any way. But my hope is, my little fantasy for this album is, I know that Journey is one of those games for people, because I get messages to this effect that they kind of fantasize about being able to experience for the first time again, that first time when it was new and fresh and you didn't know what it was. For a decent amount of people, remarkably, that's become a very sort of special moment for them as a in their memory of being a gamer. And I know for a lot of people, we got these beautiful messages about how cathartic it was, and there's there were a lot of very personal stories that came out of it. And so for those people, my hope is that this album gives them the closest approximation that is possible to experience it for the first time again, because it's faithful enough to the original material that it's hopefully unmistakably Journey, but it's fresh enough that it feels like a continuous parade of new versions and surprises and things that hopefully are nice, and hopefully it feels lovely the way I hoped the original felt lovely, but in a way that they haven't heard yet, so that they get the closest that I think I can offer, at least, of experiencing it for the first time again. And for me, the reason I'm doing that is because, as I mentioned at the beginning, I wouldn't have a career if it weren't for those people. As much as I would love if new people find Journey or this new album because of this release and the hopeful kind of hype that might surround a 10th anniversary celebration. Of course, it would be wonderful if new people find it. But really, the audience size of the original was so much beyond anything I could have possibly fathomed, that even if just some subset of those is who this album ends up finding, and they feel my gratitude that I am directing at them for it, that I'll feel great, because I literally wouldn't have a career. The money that paid for the coffee I was drinking here, and the opportunities that have come the swag. This was a gift from Stoic, the guys that made the Banner Saga. This sweatshirt I'm making, like, if Journey hadn't come out, they wouldn't have called me. Everything about everything around me is a direct byproduct of Journey having come out. There's so little in my life that isn't at this point um, an overt offshoot of it, that I just feel this overwhelming need to say thank you to them, and offer up a thing that hopefully gives them something that's newly meaningful. I can only hope, because saying thank you or tweeting, it's been a great 10 years, fam. It just feels so hollow and ridiculous. But this way, hopefully, I can offer it up. And that's this whole thing was, very DIY as a result. It's not like Sony fronted the bills for this album, although Sony has been very supportive, don't get me wrong, and that game company as well. But yeah, this was a DIY. I want to make it. I want to self-finance it. I was very lucky that a dear friend of mine, who was one of the co-founders of Ready at Dawn, and who had brought me in to help out on the Order 1886, he is very, very passionate about Journey, and he insisted on co-producing the album with me, which was an absolute boon, and we just went that much more crazy. And his name's Andrea Pacino. He's an absolute just gem of a human being, and so yeah, it going to London with him and with my friend Troy, and just recording this album with this unbelievable orchestra was a, as life-changing as anything could get, and I hope that that the people who hopefully find the album recognize that it is for them and wouldn't have been possible without them. And that's not a platitude. That's not a, we did it collective community of, like when a celebrity, like wins an Oscar and says, I want to thank my fans. It's like, well, no, to be clear, the voters in the Academy are responsible for this. And that's, or like the Golden Globes, this 70 random reporters are the people who you have to thank for this. But in my case, it really is that kind of collective hive mind of just people who spoke up and gave their support and bought the album or bought the vinyl or whatever. And I know I'm kind of going in circles at this point, but it's just I just don't know how else to phrase it. I wish I had a really snappy one-liner about why I've done this, but at least technically your question an hour ago was, what is this album? And hopefully somewhere buried in this mountain of rambling was the actual answer to that felt satisfying.
Well, and of course, people will have to just listen to it to really answer that question, because
Hopefully,
at
yes.
the end of the day, that's the most important part, is hearing the music itself. Which must have been, I mean, it sounds like an incredible experience to work with the London Symphony and produce something familiar but new, and that just sounds like a really cool. I mean, it's a great way to say thank you to fans, also. Like, pretty cool opportunity to be able to do that, and to do that really DIY, which I wasn't aware of. That's neat.
It was very emotional, because Journey's kind of become like this. People ask me, do you ever get tired of the fact that everyone keeps talking about Journey and asking relative to all the things you've done since then? And I've been lucky. I've done a pretty decent number of things since Journey came out, and worked with a lot of really interesting studios, and had really, just incredible opportunities. But Journey is the one constant, and people have asked me, does that get tiresome? Like, as an artist, aren't you kind of more focused on the new stuff? And of course I am focused on the new stuff, in terms of 99% of my thought is not thinking back on the things that I've done, Journey or otherwise. But I also recognize that I have a lot of composer friends, for example, that are by any definition very successful. And in fact, there are some that, like people that have worked in TV for decades, have made untold millions of dollars, won Emmys, all that kind of stuff. By virtually every metric that you could count, they're more successful than I am. But they've never had an experience like Journey. They've never had people seek them out and say, this music got me through the loss of my mother, or this, I walked down the aisle at my wedding to this music, or, you know, like, or cosplayers, you know, saying that this, yeah, I've never cosplayed before in my life. I had to do, I spent 8 months working on this journey, like story after story after story, times tens of thousands, you know. So I've meet people who have never had an experience like that, and I don't see it as this thing that won't go away. It's more like at the end of Star Trek Generations, the first next gen movie, when Picard at the very end gives this little kind of mini monologue to Riker, and he said, um, you know, someone told me, referring to the bad guy from 5 minutes earlier, someone told me that time is like a predator that stalks us all our life, but I think of time as a companion that goes with us on the journey and reminds us to cherish every moment, as they'll never come again. Um, so to me, it was absolute perfect way to end that movie, which I think is a wildly underrated movie. But that I kind of see Journey like that. It's become this companion to my life. It's like at any given moment I'm working on something, and there's still some kind of Journey ambience, whether it's people emailing me to say, you know, those kinds of comments, or young composers messaging me to say, you know, can I ask you a few questions about it? Or, you know, I get professors saying, can you do a Zoom masterclass with my composition students to talk about Journey or whatever? You know, even 10 years on, that still comes up. So I've seen it like it's become like this old friend that I see, you know, that we don't like live in the same city anymore, but we converge, you know, in our hometown, or at GDC or something. We see each other kind of regularly, and it's always nice to see each other, kind of thing. That's sort of what my relationship to the game feels like, which is why when conducting it felt like, you know, I'm now doing like a vacation with that old friend. We've said, you know, we always talk about doing a trip together, and it's been 10 years and we've never done it, so now we're doing it. It's like you raise the bar, and especially that music at the end, you know, that I now call Apotheosis. That piece in particular has really seemingly stood out with people. I mean, it's no surprise given that it's attached to the most powerful part of the game, and I just, as composers in games, we always know that it, you know, it's up to the game to sell our music. It's not the other way around. So if people love some given level of a game, the odds of them liking your music go up exponentially. So I'm entirely indebted to that game company for cracking the code on how to end that game with gusto. And the music was basically good enough to not distract you as being something taking away from the experience. And then this flip happens where then people start attributing the ending to the music, when I don't believe that's the case at all. But I still end up being this lucky beneficiary of all this attention, even if I, in a way, don't deserve it. And that's not trying to sound like false modesty. It's just they're reacting to the game, and the music is just the thing that they can tangibly aim at. And in my opinion, that's really not humility. I think it's just an analysis of the situation, and I'm insanely grateful and lucky, my God, lucky to be the beneficiary of that. But in any case, because of that, Apotheosis has become kind of like the single, and it's the one that's been performed by orchestras repeatedly over the years since then, and concerts and that kind of thing, and so conducting that, I saved it for the end of the recording session, and, you know, giving that downbeat with the London Symphony and playing through that piece, even with all the changes I made to it and stuff. It was overwhelming. And I never feel people say, oh my God, you know, this music made me cry. And I've never like had that to my own music. I don't see how that could happen. You know, it's like, could you imagine writing something that then makes you weep? It's hard to, you work really hard to try to make it feel very authentic and maybe even very emotional. But you just then hope it worked. It's hard to like, I've never been able to experience that, but I did find myself feeling sort of choked up, and it wasn't the music itself. It was just sort of this turbocharged, you know, Ratatouille, where he goes back in time. It was this thing of feeling like all the whole 10 years and everything that's come out of that is compressing into this moment now. and it's just
Yeah.
sort of overwhelming. And it was an unbelievable experience.
That's really cool. No, it's just pretty amazing, honestly. I mean, and that moment in the game is a very emotional and powerful moment, and I think you're right to say it's a combination of factors. The music is that tangible bit, but there's something about being in the game, being, having climbed up that mountain, getting over that struggle, being interacting with the game in a way, rather than just watching something, being participating in it, and then having that music and having that feeling all sort of crash in on you at once. It's no wonder that, that people remember that moment more than any other.
I mean, look, I know that everybody, including me, really struggled with it. It took a long time to get the ending right. I mean, it was a huge question mark for so long, because the playtests were showing that up through the mountain in the snow and the way that all ends, that was starting to really work for people. And it felt like, wow, this is poetic. This is uncompromising. It says a lot through very little. And then you'd kind of have this final level, which felt like such an afterthought. And it's supposed to be the cathartic culmination. Apotheosis means sort of that moment of transcendence. It was supposed to be that. And at best, it felt like a kind of fun, now what we would think of as the tone of a post-credit sequence, where there's kind of like, oh, by the way, there's another little fun thing we're going to throw in here. And the end, and for the longest time, the ending, at worst, it was just stupid, but at best, it was that. And it took a long time to really feel like, we understood what's the final chapter of this story. What is that last statement? How do we end this in a way that doesn't just slather on more of what we've done, or add in something extraneous that's not needed? And how I don't know how any of us managed to stick the landing, because even that music of Apotheosis, I rewrote that music 100 times, and I tried stuff that was, all over the place emotionally, really ethereal and quiet and sort of surreal and really fast and energetic. And I tried all kinds of things in between. And then it was just one of those acts of desperation where one day I came into my studio and I just thought, I don't have it and I don't know what it is, but I'm just going to not think. I'm just going to try to write something that's sort of inspired. Because I would usually like put the game up on my screen. I had a test kit from Sony that I could play, and I could actually kind of play the game as I was writing and see how it felt to, play the music in my computer while I'm playing the game, like in immediate feedback. And it was very important for the process. But this time I thought, maybe that's clouding me here. Maybe I need to just kind of make it more abstract and just take a step back and write a piece of music that answers this question of what is that sort of apotheosis supposed to feel like? I wasn't using that word for it yet. But that transcendence, that grand catharsis. And by some miracle at the 11th hour, it clicked, because we were literally like days away from recording the orchestra. And so like it was, the strings, the orchestra, again, is an overstatement, but you know what I mean? Our modest ensemble in Macedonia was booked. That time was set. We didn't have a big budget, so it's not like we could reschedule or do pickup sessions later if I came up with a better idea. It all funneled down to this, and just kind of sometimes you get lucky when the pressure is sufficiently high. And I think that the same thing really was happening with TGC on the design and art and all that kind of fronts as well. It's wild. It's wild to think how close we came to it all just not working.
Oh man, yeah, like Journey without sticking the landing, that would be terrible.
I mean, it would be an incredibly lame. The analogy I always like to make is that it's like parachuting from 30,000 feet, recognizing that you have to hit a 1 foot by 1 foot landing zone. The ability to, normally someone who's skydiving would, have like this half-mile region that they can land safely in, because there's going to be things that move you around, and it's not the most precise, maybe military paratroopers can be more precise, but short of that, you're kind of just like, the goal is mainly just to land alive. But this game was one where the target area was so narrow, because anything outside of that, it was lame. The game, it was either going to be this amazing kind of poetic gem, or the most pretentious nonsense that meant nothing to anybody. And there didn't really seem like there could be much in between. It's not like the kind of game where people would go, oh, I thought it was a little artsy and lame, but the multiplayer, like the deathmatch mode was just so fun that it kept me going anyway or whatever. Like there's a lot of games that survive based on some ancillary feature, where they it's like, oh well, I mean, think about GoldenEye 64, where the multiplayer absolutely is what thrust that game into level of classicness. I mean, it's single player campaign that sort of steps through the GoldenEye movie is fun and it's fine, but that game became one of the all-time classics because it was sort of the seminal couch co-op of its time, and it paved the way for the Halos and everything of the world. I mean, it was so. And the hilarious thing is that Rare, they weren't supposed to put multiplayer. Nintendo forbade them. They literally snuck it onto the cartridge before it was too late. After it was too late for Nintendo to stop it, and because they believed in it, but so it was one of those where, the campaign, it could be cut and the game would basically be no less of a classic. Well, Journey has nothing cuttable in that regard. It's like the whole game is the GoldenEye multiplayer and nothing else. Like there's nothing else that it could possibly, be outside of what it is. So if that thing doesn't work, just can it. Yeah.
Well, cool, man. Congratulations on this new project and all your success. And
thanks.
Yeah,
man.
I'm excited to see how this goes. I'm excited to listen to it, and yeah, it's awesome. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me about it.
Believe me, thank you. None of this without the signal boosts of this kind of thing and what you're doing for it. As we mentioned, it's a world fraught with content now, and so even with the 10th anniversary and even with the prior kind of accolades to help support it, there's no guarantee that anybody would ever find it unless I can kind of kick over those rocks. And so I just thank you to you for your willingness to help get the word out through this piece, because I think I need all the help I can get.
No, the world is a chaotic and often terrible place, but music makes it better. So,
well, I
gotta
hope
spread the music.
that's certainly no small part about why I got into music.